moderator for the Artists and Musicians After the Ring of Fire panel, and I'm very happy to be here. I want to start by asking our awesome panelists to introduce themselves, and David, how about if you kick things off?
Okay. My name is David Carrico. I've been writing in the Ring of Fire universe since 2004. A lot of my stories deal with music and musicians because my background is in music, so that's my personal interest. And I've always been fascinated with alternate history, so what better place to put it together than the Ring of Fire universe?
Awesome. Ivor?
So I'm a retired patent attorney, and I write both fiction and nonfiction for the 1632 universe. And what people are most likely to see in a bookstore would be Seas of Fortune, 1636 Seas of Fortune, which was a collection of braided short stories, and 1636 The China Venture, which I co-authored with Eric. There's also The Chrysanthemum, The Cross, and the Dragon, which is Eric Flint's Ring of Fire Press. And then there are a lot of short stories and articles in the Gazette.
Is the retirement new? Is it fairly new?
Yeah, I retired June 30th.
Excellent. Good deal.
I'm still writing, though, in that field. I have a biotechnology and law book I update each year.
Oh, nice. That sounds fun. Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert Waters. I've been writing in the 1632 universe for about 9 years. I think 2011 is when I sort of got in. I've written many individual or single stories in Grantville Gazette, and Mariah and I have written many collaborations on art styles, art techniques, uptime, and how they affect, how they may impact downtime artists. I have coming in April of 2021, my first, I guess, official Bain novel. It's in collaboration with Charles Gannon, and it's called 1636 Calabar's War. It has nothing to do with art. It's totally different. It's set in Brazil and in the Caribbean, and it continues to, I guess, build upon the New World segment of the entire universe in the series. So that's who I am.
You couldn't sneak any art in there?
I can sneak this in, which is our publication, which is sort of a, is that a take? That's a take on Johannes Vermeer, maybe? I can't remember if that was sort of a play on one of Vermeer's pieces. But that's our little buddy, Daniel Block, and one of his subjects. So I may refer to this again later.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'm a college professor, and I'm also a private investigator on the side, and amongst the other stuff I write, we've written a lot of stuff about artists, and we've actually switched to a new artist, and we're working on his second story right now, so that's pretty fun. So I'm going to ask David to start us off. You have a lot of background, as you said, in music. You've written about music and musicians. What's happening in the world of the 1632 universe in terms of music, and what do you think is most interesting about that?
One of the things that just hooked me on the whole idea of writing about musicians in 1632 is the whole concept of the Ring of Fire event. Is that 369 years worth of Western European and American musical development got dropped in the laps of the downtime musicians all at once. And musically, that's a huge culture shock. And my initial idea was, how would they react? And everything I've written has come out of that question. How would you react if 300 or 400 years of your specialty's development got dropped in your lap all at once? You know, it starts out, it's a huge culture shock because modern music is very different from what was being played back then. I mean, 1631, 1632, that's 50 years before Johann Sebastian Bach was even born. So by their standards, he would be considered avant-garde.
Yeah.
and they have no exposure to African music. They have no real exposure to Oriental music other than if the occasional gypsy caravan drives through town. The music is very plain. It's a lot of it is very religiously oriented, and comparatively speaking, everything that the came back from the future is going to sound harsh and dissonant. And it's going, you look at our timeline from the time slaves were imported to the U.S. to the time of Stephen Foster was 100 years. From Stephen Foster to Scott Joplin is another 50 or 60 years. From Scott Joplin to Louis Armstrong is another 40, 50 years. So it takes a generation or more for new styles to develop and to be accepted. And the challenge for writers is dealing with that issue. That just because it's there doesn't mean somebody's going to like the Rolling Stones, or doesn't mean somebody's going to like that kind of thing. So the challenge is, how do you introduce the music? How do you bring musicians to even consider it to be music? I mean,
Right.
you guys are close to my generation. Rock and roll. How many people said that's just noise? Well, put
Yeah.
that on steroids. That's what it's like back then. And bringing the musicians to where they can even consider it to be music and start to think about, well, maybe there is something I can do with that, is a lot of the fun.
Right. Awesome. Thank you. Um, Ivor, you have invented a lot of artists. You've written about a lot of artists. What inspired you to dig into the art world, and what interests you most about artists in the post Ring of Fire world?
Well, the answer is really different depending on the artist's character. But I knew that for China Venture, that one of the things about that mission was that they had to impress the Chinese intelligentsia, the Mandarin class, that they were not barbarians, but a group to be approached on a more equal basis. And obviously, the scientific doodads they were bringing were an important part of that, but they were not the only part. They were going to have to make some sort of a showing in the arts as well. And of course, they wouldn't be able to do that in Chinese literature, but there was the possibility of having something to show them in terms of the arts. Now, with regard to the others, both of those characters, Maria Vorst and Felix Grunfeld. Felix Grunfeld had the backstory that he was part of the entourage of the governor of New Amsterdam when he went to take control of New Netherlands in 1625. So he was there to document the New World. He was, of course, hoping that doing that would enhance his reputation. He would have artwork that was unique because so few people had seen the New World, and he would be the first professional artist on the scene, and that he could parlay into a successful career. And Maria Vorst was the character in Caesar Fortune, was a little bit different in that she was only secondarily an artist to begin with. Her father was the curator of the Leiden Botanical Gardens, and she was helping him to document what they had, which included both native European plants and stuff that would be brought back in by people associated with the big trading companies. That would be plants from Asia or from the Americas, and she would draw them. And then that was the basis for the artistic component of her career. So it's a little bit different for each of them.
Awesome, thank you. Robert, I wanted to ask you, we've used a lot of real historical artists, especially in the piece where there's an art competition. What do you see are the benefits and the pitfalls of using real historical characters?
Benefits, I think, are it's just more real. It feels real. You're dealing with real people, real historical artists who have a past, have their own likes and dislikes, opinions about what is and is not good art, and they've already, in their own timeline, in the 1632 timeline, they've already have some established understanding of the techniques that need to be used and are accepted culturally to do their work. Now suddenly you get this massive, like David says, you get this massive influx of all these different styles and techniques, and to put them into that thing, it's fun to watch them work, and just let them go and see what happens when they are suddenly introduced to all of these techniques. Now, that's the fun part. The downside can be very simply that they're going to be very resistant to it. I mean, the fact of the matter is, a lot of it will depend upon where they are professionally, in my opinion, where they are professionally in their careers downtime before the Ring of Fire actually occurred. So, for instance, an artist like we've written about in our most recent story, Broken Strings, Diego Velazquez, who is at this point, when the Ring of Fire occurs, he's pretty popular, pretty well-known Spanish Baroque painter. What does he got to prove? He doesn't. He's arrived. He doesn't need these art styles. So my feeling is that trying to enforce something on that kind of guy, a guy like that's going to be very resistant. But that's the fun part of storytelling, because then you put these people into situations where they are suddenly forced to try to at least accept the fact that these exist and that they've got to do something with them, or they might be left behind. And again, wind them up, let them go, and see what happens. So that's the pitfalls and things. Now, an artist that you make up, which is perfectly legitimate, you can have more flexibility. You can let them right off the bat, have love various styles right off the bat. I mean, why not? They're made up anyway. So those are the challenges I think you do of a fictional character that you make up versus an actual historical character that's in place.
Ivor?
I wanted to ask, following up on that, what stage was Daniel Block in his career when you took him up in Ring of Fire?
He was pretty advanced, but what happened with him, the sort of critical thing with him is that he discovered that he was not much known in the future. So all of the stuff that he'd done, he really wasn't remembered. So and wasn't he like 50 even when we started him?
He's in his 50s when it starts. Now, the reason why, well, I'm not entirely sure why he wasn't as well known historically. He was just a court painter. He's a pretty good one. Part of the reason why he did not, most of his stuff didn't survive, and there was no recollection or no information about him at all in Grantville when he went to visit, was because of a lot of his work historically got burned in a fire. I mean, most of his prints were destroyed beyond the Ring of Fire. I think somewhere in the late 1640s, 1650s, I think. Mm-hmm. So you're right. He is at a position where he's pretty well established and well advanced in his own styles, but nobody knows he existed in the future, or at least as far as he's concerned, he didn't make a mark. So a guy like that would be much more receptive, I think, even though he's advanced along the way, to try to make a mark and to adopt uptime techniques and styles so that this time around he can make sure that he does what he has to do.
Ivor?
Yes, so there were only, of my viewpoint artist characters, there were only two that were historical, who were Judith Leister and Larouche. And Judith Leister, at the time she becomes involved in China Venture, which is 1634, she's in her 20s, she's 25 years old. And she only, the year before, had become admitted to the Guild of St. Luke's. So she is really at the very start of her career. And so one would expect that she would be more receptive. And she, in the story, does get involved with photography because essentially her way is being paid for by people who are interested in selling cameras, photographic film, photographic paper, etc., etc. And they want both to see if she can make sales eventually in China, but also equally important, bring back images and say, you know, this was done with our camera or our paper or our film, and you ought to be buying our stuff as well. So she's pushed in that direction. The other one, Lou Rushi, we actually only know, we know that her paintings were highly regarded, but only a few of them survived. And while she's important in the story, her painting doesn't figure prominently in it. So we really don't see how receptive she would be, for example, to what was brought in by the West. It was not developed in China Venture.
Yeah. David?
Going back to something Robert said, a lot of the issues he identified also would be common to musicians of the era. So far, there have been four or five big name musicians used in the series. Girolamo Frescobaldi is portrayed in the story as being very prickly and very authoritative, which seems to fit fairly well with his historical character. And he did exactly what Robert said some visual artists would do. He rejected the uptime music. He considered it to be barbaric and not cultural or civilized. On the other hand, Enrico Toro brought in the character Giacomo Carissimi, who came from northern Italy. And one of the things he found out when he got to Granville was exactly what Robert described. There wasn't a lot of his music that survived. He was an extremely well-known composer, influential, very well-known in Rome, very well-known to the papal system, yet very little of his music survived to the era and to our era, and that disturbed him. And then the character Heinrich Schütz that I use, well-known German composer, a fair amount of his music did survive. He was skeptical about the uptime music, and then somebody played him some music that he had supposedly written in 1647.
Oh,
And
wow.
this puts him into an existential crisis. And he spends several days, swimming around in bottles of wine, trying to cope with, how can I write this when I haven't lived that, but they say it's me, and on and on and on. So it's not just black and white. I'll take it or I won't take it. A lot of it is just sheer bewilderment at the magnitude of what's been brought back, and how do I cope with this? What does it mean that I wrote music that I haven't written?
Right. Well, let me add, one of the things that was a challenge for us in our research was that you have, on the one hand, whatever research we can find today, and as a college professor, I have access to librarians and libraries, which has been of enormous value. But on the other hand, you also have what would have actually been in Grantville. And that is such a smaller slice of reality. Robert and I actually had a big fight once because he wanted to use an art style that I was positive nobody in Grantville had any record ever actually existed, and it was ugly. There was blood and everything. It was violent, but I think that's a really interesting aspect of it, that you didn't bring New York City across. You brought Grantville, and Grantville does not, like, they have their school, and you had art teachers and you had music teachers, so you'd have some stuff, but you wouldn't necessarily have, like, Grantville didn't have their own opera. They didn't have what did they have is the question then, and it's something that we all work with and is a challenge. Ivory, you had your hand up.
Yeah, a couple of points. It- there's not just the problem of whether these musicians or these artists would accept the avant-garde music, the later music and art, but also if they accepted, will their patrons follow suit? I believe you had a character in one of your stories who was extremely irate about how his daughter was portrayed.
Yeah.
Is
Hmm.
that
Yes,
right?
that's the cover of the book he showed.
Yeah. 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 That's his
Kayla
daughter,
Barnes right
Kayla Barnes. That's the artist's impression of Kayla Barnes. So, and she's what, 16,
there. 16, I
17?
think. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it can cause quite a stir, you know. So
Yeah. Well, musicians have the advantage that they have two different media that the music could come back through. They would have the hard copy printed music, which would mostly be in the schools and mostly be in the churches and in the homes of the local piano teachers. And frankly, that would be a very, very limited subset. Then there's the recordings. And musicians of that time were very adept. I mean, it was a known skill. You were known for how well you could pick something up and play it by ear.
Mhm.
So the recordings and the listening taste of the Granvillians, as small a population as it is still broad enough that there's going to be a lot of examples.
Mhm.
And so, depending on which musician you want to hear, you can probably find at least some samples of his or her performances or similar performances in Grantville. Now, you won't find everything. I mean, I'm a Johann Sebastian Bach fanatic, and it grieves me to know that not everything he wrote is in Grantville.
Right.
But I know that a representative example of his music is there, both in print and in recording. And one of the things I've built into my stories is something called the Grantville Music Trust, whose sole purpose is to listen to all those recordings and get the music notated before the technology wears out.
That's a real concern, because it's not just a matter of the CDs going bad, but really more of the CD players going bad, I would think, especially if the quality of the electricity isn't that high. I was also wondering, is our sheet music familiar to them? Is it the
No,
same, more or less?
and they could transition to it, but the style is noticeably different. And even in that time, from publisher to publisher, there might be differences in how notes and staffs were put on the page. So that would be an adjustment that would have to be made. And in one of my stories, I had them reprint the score to the Messiah, so that they could do a first performance of Handel's Messiah in 1635. And
Nice.
one of the challenges was finding a printer who could either engrave that work or somehow come up with typography to print it. You know, I didn't
That's a
dwell
whole
on that. I
extra
just
thing.
said it's a problem and went on and told my story. But I mean, you can't dwell on the technology. You have to write about the people.
Right.
Right, right. Nice. So Robert, you mentioned to me earlier you had thoughts about how aspiring authors could go about determining how to approach a story about art styles and culture and so forth.
Yeah, I've got 5 nifty little things written down. I can probably cover a couple of them at least before people get tired of hearing me. Okay, so here we go. All right, so now one of the things, and maybe we've sort of gently touched upon it already, but I don't believe that uptime art styles, probably just like music, and correct me if I'm wrong, David, won't spread through downtime culture uniformly. You know, I don't believe that now I think that the knowledge that it exists will probably spread relatively uniformly like ripples in a pond. But I think that the adoption of uptime techniques and styles will ebb and flow. There'll be fads, there will be trends, and never underestimate the power of national pride. I can very much envision a country like Spain, for instance, adopting Cubism and Surrealism simply because Picasso and Salvador Dali came from Spain. It could be. Now, a lot of it will depend upon who adopts it. You know, if the rich, the powerful, the important adopt it, then you know a lot of times that springs a trend or a fad, and it happens. But it wouldn't surprise me in the least that you get those kinds of things where certain art styles, certain trends. So that's something to look at if you're looking at trying to be an artist and work on a story using uptime art and how it impacts downtime artists. Another thing you want to, we've already touched upon that not all artists will embrace universally uptime styles. You know, a lot of it about personal interest, personal opinions, the level of their current techniques and qualities and abilities. I think it's a good idea to look outside the USC, to look outside Germany. There's a lot of great uptime artists from Germany. There are many that are worth doing. But one of the reasons is kind of ironic. We were actually looking for a downtime artist outside the USC, outside Germany. We were looking for actually an Eastern European artist, or at least I was, when we first started talking about possibly writing about art. I happened to stumble upon Daniel Bloch, who comes from Germany, because his son, Benjamin Bloch, which is in all of our stories, actually becomes an artist in his own right by, 1650s. He married a Hungarian artist, and they happened to mention Daniel Bloch's name in a description of Benjamin Bloch, and so I started to look into Benjamin Bloch, and that's where we fell as far as the story is concerned. And one other thing I want to point out, and then I'll leave it alone. Let us see the world through an artist's eyes, okay? And by that I mean you've got this person whose profession, whose life is looking at color, looking at light and dark, looking at how the world around him or her could be created in art. So I think it's necessary for you at some point during any stories that you write to let's see it, let's see them at work by just imagining. So I'll give you a quick example. Mariah and I, in one of our last Daniel Bloch stories, the Winter Canvas, Daniel is on his way home from a commission further up into Mecklenburg. I think he was in Mecklenburg. He loses his son, his young son, Benjamin Bloch, in a snowstorm. While he's frantically looking for this boy in the snowstorm, he starts imagining the stark beauty of the world, of all the snow falling and the wind blowing and the light casting shadows and stuff. This is a crisis moment, and yet he can't pull himself out of who he is and what he does. And we felt that it was very important to showcase how he sees the world as he's trying to find this forest, as he's trying to find. I think it's important. I think I think it's very fun and important to do. And it pulls, in my mind, it pulls the readership in to, you know, to really buy in and invest on the story and the characters that are in there. Looks like we might have lost. Ah, here she comes back.
Yes, she's trying.
Sorry, bad internet out here on the farm.
So I'm done. I'm done.
Okay. Um, Ivor, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some uptime techniques and materials that have influenced art, including photography, maybe fairly briefly, but take a few minutes and tell us how that's impacted the Ring of Fire universe.
Did we lose it? No,
Did I freeze again?
Time.
I switched to a whole different internet.
You
have me?
see, I'm getting a message. Your internet connection is unstable, so we'll see whether that's referring to you or me. Anyway, in the Felix Grinfeld stories, Felix's wife is quite a bit more practical minded than he is. And she starts steering him toward finding sort of a niche that other people haven't gotten into.
Looks like we might have lost.
Yeah, I think it's Ivor's connection that's iffy.
And they start working on developing lithography. Okay. Maybe you better move to someone else then, Mariah, if they're having trouble. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we got you back.
Hello? Okay. And what I think is interesting there is that with these new techniques, you have to realize that Granville doesn't have complete documentation on any of them. And even if it had greater documentation than it did, for art, as with many things, there's stuff they don't write down in the books, but you have to figure out the hard way just by doing it. So even after he and his wife traveled to Sohnhofen to get the very fine-grained limestone that was used for lithography, they still have a process in which they have to figure out the sort of wax that they're applying, the acid etch, which stones work out best and things like that. And, you know, they have failed attempts as well as successful ones. But ultimately, he does have a successful work, and that one actually is a shout out to the rescue of the Duchess and bringing her to the king and Maria to the king in the Netherlands to be married. So he does this sort of a triptych lithograph that's showing the various stages of the rescue. So that would be one example. With regard to the photography, that's, you know, quite a bit more advanced technology, and we're only seeing the beginning. The main limitation there is that they really don't know how to make film that's sensitive all the way from red to violet, so panchromatic film. And that's going to affect what subjects are really amenable to at least color photography and how the images look.
That's tough.
But I would say, you know, in general, that the techniques that were in photography that were used in the 19th century, many of them, they'll be able to do something with, certainly by 1636 or so. The results may not equal that it's perfected in the 19th century, but they might be more expensive, they might be smaller scale, but we can expect something to be done with a lot of those techniques. And of course, I should say that
It's interesting. It
photography is
reminds.
different than painting. You don't, there are some things that are common to both, but there are other things that are different. I mean, the painter, is capturing the scene in their mind's eye. They may decide to modify what they see and combine it with something else. Photography, you have to worry that the speed of the film allows you to capture only certain things and not others. And it then is unrelenting unless you actually modify the negative or the print afterwards.
An enormous amount of art was also religious art, which you wouldn't really use photography for, probably. Would you agree with that?
In general, but you could, just like there were staging of tableaus particularly in the 19th century, you could stage a religious tableau and photograph it. Whether that would be worth doing as opposed to simply painting it, that I'm not so sure. But that would be a workaround.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it would be an artist issue, but how much travelogue photography is going to be visible in Grantville? How many books are going to have, color photographs of cathedrals and mansions and palaces and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a whole interesting topic, the art of architecture and so forth. David, let me ask you, what percentage of the music of the 1630s and before would have been religious versus entertainment?
A high proportion of it. And I make a distinction in my writing between the music of the streets and the music of the courts. And most of the religious music would be music of the courts. And it would be sponsored by either patrons of the nobility or by the nobles of the church themselves. The various bishops, the various archbishops, the cardinals, they would fund those I mean, you look at the life of Johann Sebastian Bach. He spent most of his life as a Kapellmeister, a chapel master, and was writing new music every single week for the religious services. So that's part of for that era, that's part of the background, that's part of the structure, that's part of the culture. And they would embrace and investigate the religious music that came back. The street music, think folk songs, a lot of them bawdy and scurrilous. Yeah, what they sing in the taverns, what they sing in the streets, it may be the same melodies as some of the music in the church music, because it was well known. There was a particular melody that was used in French masses for like 200 or 300 years that started out as a tavern song. So that kind of thing, it's not black and white. It's either street music or it's church music. There's some cross fertilization, but you have to dig to find some of it sometimes. Probably touching base on the technology question, one of the big things is the musical instruments that come back that they know nothing about. The uptimers can't teach the downtimers anything about making violins or violas or the larger string instruments. They can do those, but the guitar is in its infancy in this time frame. And if we bring back, forgetting electric guitars, just bringing back mature acoustic guitars is going to be, incredibly enlightening to the luthiers of the day. Saxophones don't exist. The entire saxophone family will be a shock. And personally, I think the saxophone is going to be the new second instrument for Scotland, I think, right behind the bagpipes.
I had to play the saxophone for 3 months in school, and I'm not quite over the trauma yet.
The whole concept of how woodwinds are fingered, the key structure, that's consistent. It's called the bum key system that was developed in the 1800s. It doesn't exist back in this time frame. The
Wow.
piano was not developed until the early 1700s. These people have never seen a piano. They have no idea of what a piano can do. Piano music is going to be an explosion in their perception of how to do music. Brass instruments, tubas don't exist. All the brass instruments are straight horns with no valves. Now the technology is well within the technology to do brass and the technology to build a piano, that's within the capabilities, but they've never seen the concepts. So this is going to be literally revolutionary.
Well, that's exciting. That's really exciting. Are there any instruments being used in 1630 whatever that we don't use anymore that would be really interesting?
Yeah, mostly some odd woodwind instruments. The only one I can think of off the top of my head was called a shawm. And I think Bernard Herrmann actually used it in the soundtrack to the movie Journey to the Center of the Earth. I think there's a passage where he scored that particular instrument, but that's the only modern usage of it I know. It was fading away in this time frame. The transversal flute with no keys was very common in that time frame, but I think the modern flute will probably replace it. There were lots of variations on strings. They hadn't standardized on this violin design, this viola design, this cello design. They hadn't quite standardized on that. So there were variations of those kind. There was a viol and a violin, and there were differences between them, although they look a lot alike to our eye and sound a lot alike. Theorbos, the lutes, of course, were still pretty popular at that time frame, but were beginning to fade away as the guitars got larger and louder. So yeah, there's a number of instruments available in the downtime era that the uptime musicians are going to think are weird or that's interesting. You know, that they're not part of our modern palette, so to speak.
It seems to me that somebody needs to start planning a major annual music festival in Grantville. In that light, it seems like I just could imagine hundreds, maybe thousands of artists and musicians flocking to Grantville, seeking information, seeking, all these advances, new techniques, new tools. Doesn't that seem like something that might happen in reality? What do you guys think about that? No
Well,
comment.
if that many showed up at one time, there'd be a crisis on our hands, probably. Just maybe you're right. I mean, the reality is maybe that's very possible, but just to be able to just sort of like, push through as many stories as you can in order to showcase, how downtimers will be impacted by art and music. It may not be a practical thing to do, in as far as stories concerned. Although I do like your idea about a music festival. if that hasn't been already done, I think that's a great idea. Also, an arts fest too. What might
Mhm.
be also another thing. Now, I know that Magdeburg at this time, because of Lady Simpson, has really become an epicenter of art and culture. So I see no
Yeah.
reason why there couldn't be one in there.
There's
You did
Eric's
have an art. You did have an art competition, didn't you? Where I
We did
am.
have an art competition, yes, and that was in Magdeburg, and that's a major portion of the novel, The Persistence of Dreams. And there's a number of other artists that we introduced in that too, who came from other parts of Europe. Like there were the Linane brothers who came from France, who were three prominent artists of the time, and Artemisia Gentileschi, who is a very prominent artist of that time, and she's still popular. I mean, she is still, they still write articles about this lady, and they still find art that that they have that was lost and then it's come back and stuff like that. So she's in there as well. So yeah. I mean, Magdeburg is becoming a quite the epicenter of music and art.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the new opera house. David?
Yeah, and
Yeah,
we introduced that too.
that was basically the point I was going to make, is that Magdeburg, being the capital of the USC, is kind of by default the cultural center right now. And
Right.
so most of that kind of thing I would anticipate happening in Magdeburg. Eric's vision of Grantville is it becomes the technical research center, and the libraries are there, but that all the creative emphasis for the arts is located in Magdeburg because that's where most of the patrons are. So
Right.
that's kind of where that's going. You were talking about Artemisia. One of the things, if somebody wants to write for this era, one of the things that is hard to, maybe not hard, but is finding downtimer female characters is sometimes a bit of a challenge, because in this era, most of the artwork, most of the notable musicians are men. But there are some. I mean, you've got Artemisia. They just published Flight of the Nightingale, where I have a short novel involving Francesca Caccini from Florence. She may well have been the best musician in northern Italy at the time, even better than Monteverdi. But she didn't get the historical record that he did. Her music wasn't preserved. She didn't last as long in her position as he did. And basically, if I remember correctly, they don't know exactly when she died. She just faded away. So you can find characters like that, but you have to look for them. But
Hey,
yeah,
sorry, finish. I thought you were done.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Jay Robinson wrote a series of stories which prominently featured Prudentia Gentileschi, the daughter of Artemisia. Uh, she has the advantage of being both a historical character and one about whom very little is known, so that you can still fill in quite a bit of the blanks. And because she appeared in some of the earlier Gazette stories, I think J-Star Writing, maybe Gazette number 5, thereabouts, she's frequently has a cameo role in later stories. I know she's been mentioned in my stories, in Seas of Fortune. She's been mentioned in Virginia DeMar's stories, and so forth. There are a few others. I know there was another woman who some think one was admitted to the Order of St. Luke's, the Guild of St. Luke's, excuse me, before Judith Leister. I can't think of her name right now, but admitted, that is, on the basis of her own career, independent career as an artist, as opposed to her husband having been an artist and she took over the business kind of thing. There are a few, but they are certainly relatively rare.
The
Yes,
other
several of the artists we wrote about were historical women. Artemisia Gentileschi's team in the art competition was mostly made up of historical female artists, but we did have to definitely do some looking to find them. Yeah,
Yeah.
David?
The other thing you can do is you can, if you're interested in a character who doesn't exist in this time frame, and if he's a later historical character, maybe you can mine his family,
Mm.
because the my short novel Bach to the Future, which is in the Flight of the Nightingale book, features the grandfather and the two great uncles of Johann Sebastian Bach and what they felt like when they discovered the music of their descendant, who, because of the Chaos Butterfly, will now never be born.
Mm. That's complicated, huh?
Yeah, so you can dig back and maybe find characters related to somebody you were interested in a later time frame, and work with them as well.
Awesome,
Did
thank you.
that to a certain degree. Um, Maria Vorst goes to Suriname, and she is aware from a book she was lent by by the art teacher at the high school of Maria Sibylla Marion, who in the 1650s went to Suriname and drew pictures of plants and insects and so on and so forth. And so it's not that she's based on her directly, but she's aware of that future history, which shall never be. The other is that while there were Felix Grinfield, who, as I said, went to New Amsterdam in the backstory to his character, and while there were no professional artists that I'm aware of in the Netherlands that early, there was one there in 1638, and then several more in the 1640s, and in an even greater parallel, there were two that went with Moritz to Dutch Brazil, to Recife, to sort of document what the expedition was finding. And so the concept of an artist going in the entourage of an expedition to the New World, that was in history, even if it was had not yet happened. And so I took that into account as just, sort of verifying the plausibility of what I was doing with the character.
Right, awesome. Ivor, I wanted to ask you to tell us about the color blue.
Oh my gosh. Well,
Briefly.
briefly. Well, we probably can't do much with it now. The question came up actually in a panel we were on a few years ago, and in the Q&A about what blue pigments and dyes were available. And at the time I thought, gee, I'm not really sure. I know about ultramarine and I know about azurite and a few others, but I'm not sure what else is available. And so I did write an article for the Gazette. It was called True Blue, Blue Pigments and Dyes in the 1632 Universe. One thing that will be interesting will be to see if the China mission comes across some of the blue pigments and dyes that they had in China that were actually extremely impressive in their properties, and which were actually similar in structure to the Egyptian blue, which had been essentially lost to history. So I guess that given how late we are in the talk, I'm just going to refer to that article in the Gazette.
This is probably a good time to point out there has been a fair bit of nonfiction published in the Gazette. you know, from the perspective of the 1632 series, but also just actually historical stuff or logistical. How do we do radio, for example? Some really, really fascinating stuff. So if people haven't checked that out, they definitely should, in addition to all of the awesome fiction.
David has
Um,
what, 2 articles on music? What
Yep.
would happen with music in the Gazette? I have a 3-parter on photography. As you said, there have been several on radio and various aspects of that. Rick Boatwright, several others have written on that. I'm not offhand sure what else there is that's specifically about art and music.
Well, I can refer to one. At the end of The Persistence of Dreams, Mariah, with her great access to VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University's art staff, was able to put together basically a very good nonfiction piece in the back about all the artists, uptime artists that we refer to. So there's small biographies in the back of all of those, plus all of the art styles going back even prior to the Ring of Fire and also coming up to the modern times. So if you're interested in looking further into art and what is possible in the series, definitely take a look at Persistence of Dreams, because it has a great source, a nonfiction source at the end that can give you some good information and good, resources to base some of your ideas on.
and a colleague of mine is an art historian, and she was able to review all of it for me. So hopefully it's all accurate. I also wanted to point out a tool that I have used, which is Wikipedia, which is a tremendous tool, you know, within its realm. But you can do a search on like Hungarian artists or German artists or, you know, English musicians, and look for the years. I think they actually separate them out by decades maybe, but there are ways of finding people who are real people who existed then. So that's a tremendous tool as well. So we have 2 or 3 minutes left. I'd like to get you guys each to tell us about a work that is either just out or out soon, or that you want to let people know about. David, do you want to start?
Um, my latest book from Bain is 1636 Flight of the Nightingale. It contains two short novels, Flight of the Nightingale about Francesca Caccini, and Bach to the Future, which is Eric's title, not mine, which deals with the Bach family prior to Johann Sebastian Bach. In addition, my latest Ring of Fire book from Ring of Fire Press is Magdeburg Noir, which was published in January and contains 3 short works dealing with the gritty side of life in Grantville and Magdeburg.
Nice. Ivor?
Well, I think the latest work I had probably would be 1636, The China Adventure with Eric. There were actually 2 spin-off stories, essentially subplots that had been part of early drafts that fell by the wayside, and one of them developed into The Chrysanthemum, the Cross, and the Dragon, which is Eric Flint's Ring of Fire Press, and another was the short story Escape from Nagasaki. I am working right now on the sequel to Seas of Fortune, and I'm at it somewhere around the 80,000 word mark, but it's still got quite a
Nice.
ways to go before I'm done with that. And so every once in a while I say, okay, I'm putting that away. I'm going to write some nonfiction, which I just finished recently. So that'll be it for me right now.
Awesome. Thank you. Robert?
For me, I've already mentioned, our Persistence of Dreams. I also have written other things for the Ring of Fire Press. I have a fantasy series going on right now. The first novel is The Masks of Murata, and the second novel, which was published this year, is The Thief of Cragsport. I'm currently working on the third novel in that series. I've already mentioned 1636 Calabar's War, which will be out in April 2021. That begins to deal with this issue of slavery in the New World. It's a significant issue, and it needs to be start to be addressed. And Eric and I are working on a project, but I can't say anything about it because it has not been made public yet. So I have to hold my tongue on that. But I'm pretty excited about where that's going right now. So
Excellent.
Yes, it is. And I won't say anything outside the ring. I mean, I've got some other things coming, but I will just stick to a Ring of Fire.
All right, awesome. I will mention Robert and I have the second story we're telling about Juan Pareja, who um, is a fascinating person. He's unfortunately most famous right now for a portrait that Diego Velázquez did of him. It's extraordinary. But we already have one story published about him, and we're very, very excited to be working on the next one. It's actually my turn to get it back to Robert, but life's been a little bit complicated. When you're a college professor and there's a pandemic, things get complicated. So, but that's going to be coming out soon, so that's something to look out for. And I'll leave for about out of time. So I want to thank everybody for participating in the panel, and I want to thank everybody who watches, and please reach out to us if you have questions, and we're delighted if you would like to hurl a bucket of money at us. You're always looking for patrons, which is unfortunately not much of a thing anymore. But thank you. I think we're good.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.